Right, this is my little poem I just wrote. Are you ready? ASMR. Live down. Back again. Tingles, tingles, tingles. I pray to crazy. What about Chesney? What about Richie? What about baby? What about Rich? What about my bitch? What about rights? What about fights? What about freedom? What about nights? What about genuine? What about family? What about aunties? What about family? What about prayers? What about faith? What about childhood? What about Wraith? What about Netflix? What about Semtex? What about shoes that you only wear when you have sex? What about makeup? What about glam? What about a name as delicious as Dan? What about mermaids? What about gold? What about brothers that were too fucking cold? What about fathers? What about fairies? What about Imogen? What about Mary's? What about Bethany? What about Lauren? What about Scott Mayer? What about Jonathan? What about initials? I'm simply jotting. What about MC? What about blooding? What about towns? What about countries? What about all of them common currencies? What about spiders? What about snakes? What about prayers, mate? What about faith? What about fairies in a field of their own? What about Ting? She's been so alone. What about thinking? What about dead men? What about a ship that they never went sinking? What about millions? What about Lindsay? What about Scotland? What about Dingy? What about Heightsman? What about Nightman? What about Fleasman? What about driving? What about thieves? What about fleas? What about Patchman? What about these? What about Tyson? What about Teddy? What about Bison? My mic's never Betty. What happened at the nights I was on the mic and you never listened? What will happen to memories that never did listen? What about the resies? What about memories? What about all of them motherfucking prezzies? What about all of this that didn't get messy? What about John? What about Nessie? What about Annie? What about Tracy? What about Crazy? What about Deji? What about Tingles? What about fire? What about smoking? What about liars? What about whispers? Tingles and Dingles. What about timers? What about Dingles? Dingles, 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 Dingles. Dingles, 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 Dingles. What about dogs? Look, he's on the camera. What about flashing? What about answers? What about chains? What about dresses? What about shoes? What about letters? So I'll say again. What about him? What about Scotch? What about Grandad? Are you old fucking jock? What about heights, man? What about dreams? What about driving? What about fleas? What about Patchman? What about Tyson? What about Teddy? What about Bison? What about Nightman? Like you never fucking listened? Or because the chord's completely fucking wrong when it was written? What about John? What about D? What about living the American dream? What about love, man? What about this? What about bears, man? What about kids? What about snakes, man? What about Because I'm not emceeing and I ain't a joke. So do you like these blues? Or what more tunes? Do you like my dog? He's ready to snooze. Do you like my eyes? Do you like my cigarettes? Do you like my candles? Do you like my beds? Do you like my teeth? Not tonight, it's okay. Because I've got my water, so I'll be okay. What about mummies? What about yummy? What about tightening up my tummy? What about weights? What about scales? What about ice? What about meals? What about sleepy? What about dogs? What about foxes? One